Hello again, class. Happy to be addressing you all from my office on the Coweta campus. You'll notice the lighting is much better in this video, as I assume the sound is as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the short stories by Edgar Allan Poe. If you watched my introduction to Poe video, we read a wonderful little story called The Masque of the Red Death, which is very linguistically powerful and has some interesting thematic concepts and beautiful imagery, and it was a good read. I felt very into it. If you watched the video, you may have been able to tell that I was a little bit excited. I don't get out very much. Anyway, today we're going to talk a little bit about the other stories that I assigned by Edgar Allan Poe, and those are The Fall of the House of Usher, uh, The Casket Montiado, The Telltale Heart, and The Pit and the Pendulum. These are four of the short stories you can find in the anthology. Now, if you have not read these already on your own, please do not use this video as a substitute for reading them. I am going to talk a little bit about them, analyze them a little bit, give you some sort of feedback. I may even read one or two of them. But I don't want you to take this video as a stand-in for actually going and reading the content. You really need to put your nose to the grindstone and read this stuff, especially if you're going to write an essay on Poe. Remember, you have a choice of essays to write for essay one. If you're going to write about Edgar Allan Poe, then you should probably read the stories, right? So, but I still want to go ahead and just give you the sort of guidance you need to understand these stories. And so without further ado, I will do that. So what we need to do first, I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, cool. Whoop, there's the abyss. Okay, so what we're going to look at first is this is the complete tales of Edgar Allan Poe. This is the anthology that is in Blackboard. You can find it in the texts for fall semester folder under the unit 1. It's up near the top, and once you get there, there are little hyperlinks in the table of contents that will take you to the individual stories. I have already clicked on the Telltale Heart in the table of contents, so we're going to start here. I will read this to you, and I will stop periodically to give you some input and some analysis. Because this story is fairly short by comparison to some of other Poe's works, we should be able to get to it without making this video too terribly long. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven and in earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. So right off the bat, you give a certain characterizing of the speaker. This is not someone who is of sound mind. This is a person who is suffering from madness of some kind, some manner of sociopathy or psychopathy. I always confuse the difference. But this is not a sound person. And when we think about madness, the concept of madness, if you will recall when I mentioned in the intro video how the Romantics were dealing with the sort of encroaching of science on the way that we understood the world, prior to the scientific revolution, if someone was insane, if they had madness as we understand it, it was believed that they were possessed by demons. And in fact, much of the treatment, so-called, that these individuals would receive was really just like exorcisms and stuff, and it really wasn't very helpful. But when the scientific revolution came around, we started to think about everything in very logical terms, and instead of attributing things to supernatural phenomena like demons or evil spirits, we instead started to try to understand what is the functional cause of whatever the issue is, be it madness or some other phenomena that we attempted to understand. And so we began to look at insanity from a cause and effect way, and we tried to understand, really understand, what is going on inside the brain of a crazy person. We assume that it isn't demons, but it's something some sort of product of nature or circumstance, or there's something going on in the real world that can be understood that is leading these people to think this way. And Poe really tried to get inside the mind of what someone you would refer to as insane and figure out not only what they think but how they think. And really, that was very, very well ahead of its time, because a lot of the advents of modern psychology had not yet come about. And yet Poe was able to sort of get in the mind of these people a little bit, and in a way that's convincing. You can believe this story, actually. I think is one of the things that makes it so powerful. Okay, so moving on to the next paragraph. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus to rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. I do want to mention before we move on, the notion of an eye. Like, what is it about an eye? The eye as a symbol. People say the eyes are windows to the soul. People also say, they refer to a concept called the evil eye. Someone will use an eye to put a curse on you, or use their eye to put an evil will upon you. So the eye has always been a focus of like supernatural obsession. So it makes it really a perfect symbol for what it is that drives this person to vexation. But it's not actually supernatural. It's just the sort of element of the supernatural that is affecting his mind. He cannot stand the eye. Also, you mentioned a vulture eye. Well, a vulture is a bird, a carrion bird, meaning a bird that eats dead stuff. Carrion birds in literary context generally are the harbingers of death. They foreshadow death. They foreshadow decay. They are generally a very negative symbol. So we see that this fixation, this sort of fixation that the narrator has on this eye, it's not normal. It's not natural. There's something weird going on here. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out, and I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights. Every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he has passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Okay, a couple of things going on in this paragraph. Number one, he's sort of bragging to you. Also, his logic for why he isn't mad is that he was meticulous in doing something that's absolutely crazy, right? So he's illogical. He's bragging about what he's done. He's like, oh, you would have loved to see how I did. So we see this a lot. Serial killers often want to get caught because they do these things for notoriety. They want people to understand that they were able to do this without detection or without someone stopping them. So it's a very egotistical thing to do. And you see that this guy is displaying these characteristics fairly apparently. And we also see that like he really doesn't have any ill will towards the old man, which makes it even more crazy, right? Because if you don't have any ill will towards the guy, why are you killing him? What's this deal with the eye? That fixation is totally uh, erratic. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think, there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. So this is very voyeuristic, like he's watching this man, he's stalking him, and he does so at the same time every night. There's like a sort of obsessive, compulsive want to stalk his prey, as it were. Very creepy stuff. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or grief, oh no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening, with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had ever since been growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but he could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a little, very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought my heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped in the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. You'll notice one thing is that he keeps repeating himself. He keeps saying he was stone dead, he was stone dead. This kind of repetition is, I think, meant to make him seem unreliable or seem unhinged in a way, like he doesn't even realize that he's doing it. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. Oh, yes, tell us how you hid the body. That'll make us think you're not crazy. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. The tub had caught all. When I had made an end to these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what have I had to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale. But I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much as the sound that a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited by fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible that they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream and die. And now again, hark, louder, louder, louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. Okay, and that's the end of the story. So, you know, I think it's fair to say that the heart might represent some guilt that this guy has. So he's not like completely detached from his emotions, but he has conflated this guilt with a auditory hallucination of a beating heart that he thinks is actually beating when he knows better. He knows that the guy is dismembered under the boards. This is a classic Poe story, one of the better known Poe stories. It's very suspenseful and disturbing, but it does a really good job at getting inside the mind of someone whose mind is not sound and sort of picking apart the way that they perceive and the way that they rationalize things or the way that they confuse reason for something else entirely. It is way before its time. Like I said, the whole field of psychology had not yet come into play here to the extent that it is now. And yet he was still able to know like how they rationalize things in an egotistical way and how they do experience emotions, but they do so in a way that's very different from the way we experience emotions. And they sometimes conflate these emotions with other subconscious things that come up, such as auditory hallucination or visual hallucination. And ultimately, I think it is a very powerful story. Pretty short overall, doesn't take very long to read. But there's a lot going on. And like I said, it's kind of in the romantic vein of like trying to grapple with science and superstition and you know, what is it that makes someone mad, right? What is madness and how does madness work? These are questions that we don't really like to ask ourselves because we like to think of truly crazy people like murderers and stuff as just being monsters and there's nothing to understand. But Poe really is like, no, you can understand. You may not want to, but you can figure out where their head is and why they think the way they do. And a lot of it is egotistical. A lot of it is a want to be recognized and sort of validated for these deeds, which are terrible deeds, but they are, you know, difficult nonetheless. And so they feel proud of themselves. I don't know if you guys know about the serial killer known as the Btk Killer, but he actually got himself caught because he was bragging to the police because he was so proud of himself, and he gave them information that led to his arrest. So this is a real thing, and it's cool of Poe to have been able to predict or understand that at a time when other people really couldn't. Okay, so let's read now. We did The Telltale Heart. The other one that's short enough for us to read on this video, because if I tried to read you The Pit and the Pendulum and the Fall of the House of Usher, this would be a 2-hour video. So what we're going to do instead is read, which one was it? The Casket Montiado. Okay. So the Casket Montiado is another of Poe's stories. And you'll notice that this is also about a murder, but this speaker is not insane. Now, this is, you may say, well, he murdered somebody. Of course he's insane. Well, if that's your definition of insane, but if you think about it in the legal sense, insanity is when you do something that you're compelled to do and you can't help it. Crime is when you do something and you know better, but you did it anyway. So I don't think this speaker is insane in the same way the other speaker is. And yet we see a lot of the same motifs. So let's just go ahead and get into it. And like I said, I will stop periodically and interject and bring certain things to light. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is redressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. Immolation means like burning someone. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship of wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and the opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gimmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. So the carnival season, like if you know like a masquerade or a carnival, it's like a costume party. But it was a costume party it was really intended so that you could obscure your identity and do things that were taboo, sexual things and behave in a wanton, lascivious and drunken manner. So the fact that this is set in a carnival, you recall the Mask of the Red Death was in a carnival as well. I think that setting is intentional, probably because Fortunato is being played the fool, right? And it would be common to be dressed as a fool during the carnival, which Fortunato is, right? He says, it was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bell, so he's dressed like a fool, like a jester. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" he said. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival?" "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you on the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado!" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado!" "And I must satisfy them." "Amontillado!" "As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucrezi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me, "Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry." And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. "Come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "My friend, no, I will not impose on your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucchesi—" "I have no engagement. Come." So he's totally baiting this guy, right? He's like playing with his ego. He's saying, well, Lucchesi's better at wines than you are. So he's baiting him into coming down. Excuse me. "My friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with niter." "Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado, you have been imposed upon. And as for Lucchesi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm. Putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a reliquaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They have absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. Now that's interesting. We know this guy is nobility, right? He lives in a manor. He has servants. And he's mad at Fortunato because Fortunato has insulted his family and insulted him. But he is not like, he's not the picture of like a powerful nobleman. He's not somebody to be feared or respected. Nobody respects him. Fortunato doesn't respect him. His own servants don't respect him. So I think the root cause of all of this behavior and this desire for revenge, of course, revenge is a tragic flaw, we know, right? The desire for revenge often gets tragic characters killed, such as Hamlet, for example. All of this has to do with his sense that he is not living up to his name, and that he is not powerful, and that he is not respected. And we see that there are plenty of signs to tell us that that's the case. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "It is farther on," said I. "But observe the white webwork which gleams from the cavern walls." He turned towards me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Nitre?" he asked at length. "Nitre," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy as I once was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchesi." "Enough," he said. "The cold is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." "True, true," I replied, "and indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps." Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mould. "Drink," I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us." "And I to your long life." He again took my arm, and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." "I forget your arms." He's referring to a coat of arms, right, which is like your family symbol. "A huge human foot d'or in the field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant, whose fangs are embedded in the heel." "And the motto?" "Nemo me impune lascit." That's Latin. I think it means no one insults me with impunity. So his family name is that no one insults me with impunity. And there's this snake biting the heel, right? It's a very, it's foreshadowing. He's showing what an evil guy this is. "Good," he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. We had passed through the walls of piled bones, with casks and puncheons intermingling, into the innermost recesses of the catacombs. So catacombs are like stone hallways underground where they used to inter the dead. They would like stack the bones or stack the bodies and just leave them down there. And it was better than like digging individual graves. That takes up a lot of room. It's usually underground, so it doesn't really encroach upon any of the other space that people need. And it was a way of dealing with dead people in the olden days. It's not really practiced anymore for obvious reasons. But a lot of times families such as this one would have catacombs of their own where all of the bones of the family members were interred. And so that's where they are. Let's see. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. We had passed through the walls of piled bones with casks and puncheons intermingling into the innermost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. "The nitre," I said. "See, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the walls. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture tickle among the bones. Come, come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough—" "It is nothing," he said. "Let us go on. But first, another draught of the Medoc." This guy's a bit of an alcoholic here. I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend?" he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How?" "You are not of the Masons." "Yes, yes," I said. "Yes, yes." "You? Impossible. A Mason?" "A Mason," I replied. So the Mason, he was referring to the Freemasons or Masons. It's like a gentleman's club. There's a lot of like conspiracy nonsense about it, but it's like a secret society, gentleman's club type thing. It was popular in Europe in the olden days. And so he's basically insulting him like, "You're not part of the club." And he says, "Yes, yes, I am a Mason." But if you know what a Mason is in the practical sense, it's a person that lays stone. So that is, I think, what he's referring to here. Spoiler alert. A sign, he said. It is this, I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my reliquaire. You jest, he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. But let us proceed to the Amontillado. Be it so, I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descended again, arrived at a deep crypt in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeau rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead, in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th the bones had been thrown down and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the walls thus exposed by displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior recess. In depth of about 4 feet in width, 3, in height 6 or 7, it seemed to be constructed for no special use in itself, but formed merely the interval between the 2 colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of the circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of its recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. Proceed, I said. Herein is the... I'm sorry, that's the wrong voice. Proceed, I said. Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi, he is an ignoramus, interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, I had fettered him into the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. Pass your hand, I said, over the wall. You cannot help feeling the niter. It indeed is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you, but I must first render you all the little attentions in my power. The Amontillado, ejaculated my friend, and not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of my masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the 2nd tier, and the 3rd, and the 4th, and I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labors and sat down among the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel and finished without interruption the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason-work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A cessation of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed. I aided. I surpassed them in volume and strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine, ha ha. The Amontillado," I said. Yes, yes, the Amontillado. But isn't it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo, and the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone. Yes, I said, let us be gone. For the love of God, Montresor! Yes, I said, for the love of God. But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud. Fortunato? No answer. I called again. Fortunato? No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only the jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end to my labor. I forced the last stone into position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of the bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed him. May he rest in peace. Okay, so this is a interesting little story. First of all, horrifying ending, like being walled up alive. Like that, being buried alive is a common theme in Poe's works. He was very scared of that. It actually did happen in the past to a lot of people because they didn't really have the same medical instruments that we have. And a lot of times they would pronounce you dead when you weren't actually dead, and you could wake up in the casket or something like that. And so it was a fear that people had because they had exhumed graves and they had found evidence that people had woken up in the grave, which is a horrifying thing. And I think it is a personal fear of Poe's that he was constantly afraid of. So to have this be the sort of demise of this figure is, I think, a very effective choice. So what is this story about other than revenge? And in this case, the revenge isn't, usually revenge destroys the one who seeks it. But in this case, the guy succeeds, like the bad guy wins, which is why some of Poe's works are cool because, you know, when we go to the movies, we don't expect the bad guy to win. But Poe, he'll tell you the truth like it is, you know. I mean, this is a success story, even though it is screwed up. So what is it about? Obviously, Montresor represents the decaying aristocracy. Remember, we were talking about the Romantic genre and how it dealt with the ideas of the Enlightenment. One of the ideas of the Enlightenment is that the aristocracy is not all powerful, that everyone is equal, and that everyone can rise to power by their own will, and that they shouldn't be held down by power structures that would keep them from success. So the old money, the old power of the nobility in Europe and in the Americas, it is falling apart in Poe's time. And in the case of Montresor, the character, the collapsing of his family name endows him with a great sense of impotence. He feels powerless. He feels like he is the lesser son of greater sires, as Saruman says in The Lord of the Rings. He feels like he's not living up to his family name. He comes from a great and powerful family. He's what you would call old money, right? His money has been passed down. If you're old money, it means that you didn't get money by your own means. Usually you inherited it. So old money versus new money. New money is usually like you got money because you were smart, or you did something that people liked, or you were a successful businessman or whatever. But Montresor is none of those. He is literally like the brat of a dying noble family. And so that's why he takes it so much to heart that Fortunato attacks him and insults him, and in particular insults his family. There is another version of this. There are a couple of versions of this short story, a couple of editings. In another one, he says exclusively, I did this because he insulted my family name. And that was enough to make him want to kill this guy, which seems like an excess, but I think Poe is trying to call attention to there's a real sickness and corruption that's left over in this dying aristocracy, and they're not going to give it up gracefully. They're going to hold on to however much of their power as they can for as long as they can until they literally fall apart. So there's a very scathing critique of the aristocracy in this piece, and I think perhaps you don't see it at first, but it becomes apparent once you consider some of the elements. Also, the element of wine and drinking wine and wine tasting, that is a sign of like being wealthy or noble or refined, having taste. And this story is really, you know, this guy who's like a master at wine tasting is an obvious drunk. So there's a way in which Fortunato is representing of this crumbling aristocracy as well. He is you know, sort of using his taste as a mask for his alcoholism and his moral decay in that respect. And he's a jerk, right? Don't be a jerk. Okay, so that's the second reading I'm going to give. I'm not going to read you the last two. Like I said, it would take way too long. But what I want to do is we're just going to talk a little bit about the final two stories and some of the concepts I noticed. So The Fall of the House of Usher is a story about a guy is called by his old childhood friend to come and assist his friend with a mental illness. So here we again have the theme of like madness or mental illness. The friend is an aristocrat, so we also have that theme again of like the nobility, the aristocrat, the aristocracy, and the aristocracy is decaying, right? And that's a huge theme of The Fall of the House of Usher. The House of Usher represents the legacy of a very rich and powerful family, and it is falling, it is collapsing. So this is a masterpiece of dramatic irony and structural symbolism. There are lots of symbols in this piece. Everything bleeds into everything else. And so you really need to read between the lines with Fall of the House of Usher in particular. The language of The Fall of the House of Usher is a little bit, I won't say convoluted, it is certainly ornate. It can be kind of hard to get through. If you want to seek out an audio recording, they have some on YouTube, or if you've already read it, that's good. So the setting is like swampy and dilapidated. The house is in like a cairn or like a swamp. It's in like a wetland. The house itself is run down, and he mentions at the start of the story that there's a giant fissure, like a crack, that runs down the center of the house. So even though it houses an affluent family, it's still falling apart. The story also has a highly emotional tone. You can sense the dread and the sense of impending doom and the deep concern that this childhood friend has towards this sickly Usher family, Roderick and his sister, and they're just sickly, and he's trying to help them, but he's unable to help them. He can't really intervene. He tries, but to no avail, and he's really just there to witness their doom, to witness their downfall and their collapse. So we have the theme of madness. Roderick is suffering from several different ailments, but one of them notably is like he has an aversion to light and music, and like he can't handle certain sounds. It's like he's got a constant headache. He's very sickly, and you get the sense of sickness from this story, particularly mental sickness, but also physical sickness as well. And his sister has like a disability as well, like a sickness where she suffers from catatonia and weird mental problems and physical manifestations of those problems. So the story is probably the best example of something called Poe's totality, and that's where every element in the story contributes to the deeper meaning. So usually when we read stories, you know, if you read a story and there's like a red pillowcase, you don't necessarily read into the red pillowcase, right? You don't necessarily say, well, the red pillowcase represents this. But in the case of Poe, everything is meant as some sort of gesture, some sort of symbol that contributes to the deeper meaning as a whole. And this is referred to as totality, right? So as I said, this is a continuation of Poe's critique of the crumbling aristocracy, as we see in the Casket Montiado and the Mask of the Red Death. Again, the aristocracy of Poe's time is collapsing. It is collapsing in favor of a new sort of more fluid, upwardly mobile society. And there's no room for the aristocracy in a society like that. We don't need these people that hang out in their rich, affluent homes and play musical instruments all day long and read poetry and talk to themselves. The world where those people can survive is rapidly falling apart. And if they are to be that way, then they need to make sure they do so with a certain pragmatism that they don't really have. They were raised in money, so they don't really have the skills that they need to go out and make things better for themselves. They just sort of retreat into their homes and they dabble in the arts, but the art they create is like disturbing. It's like corrupted. It's not this refined, Beethoven and Mozart and all this beauty and you know, visual potency. It's really just like dilapidated and it's falling apart. And the art they create shows that as well. The Usher twins are symbols of cultural refinement, but it's a sickly cultural refinement. They, like the house that shares their name, represent the decay of refined culture or nobility culture or aristocratic culture in America. As to what the house itself represents, obviously it represents the lineage of the family. It also represents the crumbling of that lineage and the crumbling of the aristocracy, but it could also represent the unconscious mind itself. And the split in the House of Usher could represent like split personality or the fracturing of the mind, right? And it also grapples with the subject of addiction and sickness. It causes, Roderick is described as an opium eater. And we know from Poe's own life that he did struggle with addiction, probably opium, but definitely alcohol. So this is, again, part of the sickness is this addiction or dependency on drugs and stuff like that. Near the end of the story, we have the issue of being buried alive by the sister. I forget her name. I just read it, but I forget her name. The sister is interred alive. The brother believes that she has died. He tells the narrator that she has died. He doesn't show really how she died, but the two of them like inter her in the basement so that they can avoid an inspection sort of thing. And while she's down there, the brother wakes up in the middle of the night and is like, my sister is still alive in the tomb. I know she is. And so we have that theme of being buried alive, but also that sort of madness again. It's like you buried your sister, but she's alive. And is she really alive? Do you think she is? Or what's going on here? And it's while the narrator is reading a story to his friend about a knight and a dragon, which is a really weird scene. And as he's reading the story, certain like almost supernatural events coincide with the events in the story until the sister, who was thought to be buried alive, bursts into the room with the two of them and attacks her brother, killing him. The two fall in through a crack in the floor, and as the narrator leaves, riding away, the house splits in two and sinks into the swamp. Now, this is one of Poe's stories where there are certain elements where you could say it is supernatural. It is supernatural that the sister just awakes and kills her brother, and then the house collapses into the swamp. And as he's riding away, you get this sense of this legacy, this lineage, these people who were once powerful, noble people. They have gone into the annals of history. They have been erased. Their legacy is erased. Their sickness is erased. And so, again, this is another one of Poe's social critiques. It's a very, very ornate story, and I do like it. I find that students tend not to like it as much as some of the others because I don't think it's quite as accessible. I think the language is a little more complicated. But it's full of rich symbolism. If you wanted to write an essay on the fall of the House of Usher, you have plenty to work with. Plenty to work with. Okay, so The Pit and the Pendulum. This is probably, I think it's the scariest Poe story, personally. It scares the hell out of me. I don't know about you guys. The setting is an actual torture dungeon. Okay, it really doesn't get any more terrifying than a dungeon where they torture people, right? And we don't really think about torture dungeons because they don't really exist anymore, but they definitely did in the Middle Ages. And they were areas where people were tortured for religious reasons. And this is one of the elements that makes this story so interesting. Is that because the enemy or the bad guy, the boogeyman, is the Inquisition, which is a group of Catholic clergymen who carried out severe tortures in the name of converting or condemning heretics. It is a critique on religion and religious morality in this way. So the Inquisition, who no one expects, the Inquisition was a group of clergymen, and they would literally find heretics. So a heretic is anybody that goes against the teachings of the church, either through what they say or what they do or what they believe. And the Inquisition rounded up as many heretics as they could find. And they would subject these people to torture. And they would say, you must repent. You must accept the church as being true and right. If you do not repent, we're going to torture you until you do or until you die. And so there's a lot of sadism here and really evil, evil stuff. Like, I don't really want to go into excruciating detail. The things in this story aren't really historically accurate, but there is plenty of stuff that was carried out by the Inquisition that is every bit as evil as this. So Poe's choice of the Inquisition as the subject of this story is probably intentional and probably intended to critique religion and the idea that religion makes you good. A lot of people believe this. A lot of people think that subscribing to religion will equate to a goodness of being, but not in Poe's eyes. Poe seems to show you, and really history would say otherwise, that these people are just as capable as the same kind of evil as anybody else. And that really great evil can be done in the name of religion, especially a religion like Christianity, which is supposed to be, which on paper is about goodness and kindness and all the stuff that Jesus stood for, which was treating your neighbor like yourself and being kind to everyone that you meet and sort of seeing humankind as a brotherhood. There's a great contradiction between those teachings and what the people were doing on behalf of the Inquisition in the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance. And so it is an interesting thing to think about. Why choose this enemy? Is this a critique? I think it is. Members of the Inquisition they truly believed that they could forgive each other for these atrocious sins. So you do something evil, I'll go and forgive you, then I'll do something evil and you forgive me, and then we won't have to suffer for these sins, which are obvious sins that we're committing. We're killing and torturing people here. And so they felt like ultimately all of their cruelty was justified if it meant that heretics would be caught and brought to justice. So this guy in a dungeon being caught by the Inquisition, we can only assume that he's a heretic of some kind, or at least he's done something politically to anger these people, and they're going to torture him for it. But we never actually see really the people that are torturing him. It's the dungeon itself, which is designed to be torturous just by him being in it, right? So we do know, one of the interesting things about this story is that we do know that at the start of it, since he's writing about it, we know that he survives. And I wonder, does it affect our ability to invest in the story completely? Like, does it take away the risk? We know he survives. So when we're sitting here and these terrible things are happening and he's on the edge of a pit, or a pendulum is swinging over him and threatening to cut him in half, or the walls of the dungeon are closing in on him, we know that he's going to survive it. So I wonder, does this take away from the story? I'm not sure. I'll leave that question to you. Despite the historical themes about the Inquisition and some of the other stuff, Poe took a great deal of creative license, and some historicized elements are not factual. So there are elements about it that just, the torture methods, some of the stuff about the location and the conflicts that were going on. He took a great deal of creative liberty. I don't think that really matters because there are enough parallels between what he was talking about and what happened in real life to make it a sort of a pertinent story in that way. The story is a masterful example of the ways in which suspense and terror can be used to captivate an audience. It's a very terrifying story. You have this guy wandering around in the dark and he almost falls into a pit that could have killed him. And then when they realize he's discovered the pit, they strap him to like a table, and there's this pendulum. So the pendulum is a big swinging blade, and it swings above him and it gets lower and lower and lower every time. And that's a very suspenseful effect of having this big blade just sort of get lower and lower and closer to killing him, right? And so it creates this feeling of suspense and, oh my God, how does he get out of this? What is he going to do? And the ways in which he gets out of it, like it's sheer dumb luck. He survives the pit by discovering it by accident. He survives the pendulum by rubbing the grease from his prison food on his bandages, and the rats chew him free, right? Which is really bizarre. But one thing I did notice when I was reading this is that the pit and the pendulum are yonic and phallic symbols. So yonic and phallic are terms that are used to refer to resemblance to either the female or male genitalia, respectively. So a yonic symbol is something that's like a cavern or a cave or a pit. It's resembling of sort of female genitalia in that way. Or a phallic symbol is resembling of a male genitalia. So in the case, this would be the pendulum, a sort of a phallic symbol that's swinging down from the ceiling and threatening to cut him in half. So I wonder if that's intentional on the part of Poe, or if that's just happenstantial. But in both situations, in all the situations, the three near-death experiences he has in this dungeon, he's saved by sheer dumb luck, by the intervention of external forces at precisely the right time. Right? He trips precisely at the right time. He is saved by the rats precisely at the right time. At the moment that the dungeon is closing in on him and the walls are heating up, he is saved by the French soldiers who arrive to stop the Inquisition. So I wonder about the rats as a symbol, because remember, the Romantics were concerned with the goal of enshrining nature. So are the forces of nature represented by the rats? And are we seeing that nature can be unfettered and can be overpowering even in the most controlled situations, such as a dungeon? I think that's interesting. And I think the way in which he is saved in the end is interesting, because this is one of the few Poe stories with a happy ending. And I always think, I love to talk about endings, because, when we go to the movies and stuff and we go to see Spider-Man or something, there's usually very little sense that anything is really at risk. With a few exceptions, when you watch like superhero movies and stuff like that, the protagonist is going to win. You just don't know how he's going to win. But in the case of Poe, a lot of times the bad guy wins. A lot of times the protagonist meets a terrible fate. But this is one of those stories where he gives it to you. He gives you the happy ending. I mean, I would imagine this fella's pretty traumatized. But this one is, I think, one of the more terrifying, and it more aligns with what we understand as horror, or the horror genre today. Even though that didn't really exist in Poe's time the way that it exists today, it is still a very interesting. Take on that. It kind of brings those elements into our view here. Okay, sorry. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that. So, closing thoughts on the Poe stories. If the darkness isn't your thing, that's okay. You can still recognize the literary value of his work. You can recognize the techniques and the themes and the use of Gothic elements and Romantic elements. And you can see the critique of various aspects of our society, including aristocracy and religion and other various institutions. And I think overall, his work is very, very valuable. Not only is it entertaining, but it's also critically and analytically pertinent. It is a good place to start to investigate fiction. But in the future, we're going to switch gears and look at some other texts. But if you like Poe, remember you have the option of writing Essay 1 on Poe. And if you have any questions for me about maybe what something means, or if you didn't understand something, or if you need some kind of help, please don't hesitate to reach out to me by email. Well, that being said, I think that concludes this lecture. Have an excellent week, and like I said, please reach out to me if you have any questions whatsoever.